The Turkish-backed offensive, though, into northern Syria is escalating this hour as the U.S. announces a further pullback from the country. About 1,000 U.S. troops are expected to exit the country, leaving Kurdish forces to turn to Syria's Bashar al-Assad and Russia's Vladimir Putin for help, trying to strike a deal to bring reinforcements in an effort to repel the ongoing Turkish incursion. This morning, both the Trump administration and Congress are promising crippling sanctions on Turkey.
I think you know this is an evolving situation. We're monitoring the situation carefully. As I said, the sanctions are ready to go. We'll be updating the president this morning, and when he makes the decision, we'll act.
There's going to be crippling sanctions imposed by the Congress to supplement what President Trump's administration has done. We're going to send a signal to Turkey that's unmistakable in the eyes of Erdogan and the world, and we're going to break his economy until he stops the bloodshed.
All right, but the Turkish-led offensive shows no sign of slowing down. In fact, over the weekend, Turkey claimed that it captured at least one border town on the Syrian side, something NBC News has not been able to verify and Kurdish forces dispute. And despite reports of the ISIS flag being flown in the Syrian countryside on Sunday, both Secretary of Defense Mark Esper and President Trump defended the removal of U.S. troops.
Now what we're facing is U.S. forces in trapped between a Syrian-Russian army moving north to take on the Turkish army that is moving south. I spoke with the national security team yesterday. We all talked on the phone. I talked to the president, and he is concerned. And so last night he directed that we begin a deliberate withdrawal of U.S. forces from the northern part of Syria.
The Kurds are tending to leave, and that's good. Let them have their borders. But I don't think our soldiers should be there for the next 50 years guarding a border between Turkey and Syria when we can't guard our own borders at home.
All right, joining me now is NBC News senior international correspondent Keir Simmons on the Turkey-Syria border, and PJ Crowley, former Assistant Secretary of State and author of Red Line, American Foreign Policy in a Time of Fractured Politics and Failing States. Keir, let me begin with you. You've been monitoring the situation there since this offensive began. Describe for us what is happening on both the military front as well as the humanitarian front.
Well, Eamon, we spent the day opposite the town of Kobani, and you'll remember Kobani, of course, because that was where U.S. forces, together with the Kurdish forces, fought against ISIS and won. The U.S. base above Kobani is now evacuated, and Kobani is waiting for the arrival of Russian-backed Syrian forces. So what a week for that one town, and in a sense that town's story is the story of Syria right now, with changing alliances and a changing picture on the ground. It is the fog of war, Eamon, so I could go through the different towns that appear to be being fought over, but and the main highway, the M4 through Syria, which it seems to be disputed, and there are clashes over that. But in the end, it's difficult to tell, honestly, because much of this fighting is from Turkish-backed militia, so not the regular Turkish army, but a ragtag group, if you like, of fighters that include Islamists and rebels who have fought against President Assad from the beginning. Now, of course, that goes to explain why the situation now is so delicate, because as the Kurds do a deal with President Assad in Damascus, those Assad's forces coming up through the country could meet with those Turkish-backed militia who have always vowed to fight against Damascus. It is a tricky situation, and in the background, of course, President Putin, who's able to pick up the phone to President Assad and to President Erdogan. You ask about the humanitarian situation. We still have the situation of just thousands of civilians who have fled. We've seen some of those civilians celebrating, ironically, as President Assad's forces have arrived in those Kurdish areas, which tells you something about just how desperate they have been faced with the Turkish military. So the humanitarian situation is not good. There are dozens of casualties. You could say perhaps you might have expected more, but what people really fear is that this all leads to a clash between Turkey and the Syrian army, and of course the Syrians backed by Iran and Russia, and just where all that leads. On the other hand, I mentioned Putin. Perhaps Putin is able to get a deal done that prevents that kind of a clash, but I don't think we can be confident of that.
Let's talk really quickly, Keir, about the developments that are concerning a lot of neighboring countries. The possibility of hundreds, if not thousands, of ISIS fighters, sympathizers, their family members being let out of prisons as a result of the Turkish shelling, or perhaps escaping because Kurdish forces pull away from some of those secure locations where they'd been detained. What are you hearing about what is happening in some of these sites and the return, if you will, of the ranks of ISIS back into the theater of operations?
Yeah, it's pretty clear that at least some ISIS members who were in a camp towards the south have escaped. Most of those are women and children, some of them, though, very serious ISIS fanatics. And it does appear that some of the jailers, if you like, in prisons, Kurdish prisons, where more serious ISIS fighters have walked away. Of course, it's in the Kurds' interest to suggest that ISIS fighters are going to be released, because that puts pressure on America. And, some real politic in this, Ayman, and you will know well yourself. The reality is that if President Assad's forces are flooding across the country, they have no sympathy with ISIS. So if they capture those ISIS members, then I think their future is pretty bleak. So it's difficult to know. That's the honest truth. This is a moving, shifting conflict, changing every hour. Exactly how this is going to shape up is difficult, but certainly ISIS is trying to regroup and trying for a resurgence in the chaos.
Let me bring in my colleague, NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, who's inside northern Syria for us. He now has managed to join us. Let me pick up. All right, so it seems like we just lost that connection that we were trying to establish with him at the top of the hour. PJ, let me come to you next and talk a little bit about this, because we can almost go point by point from some of the president's justifications for what he did. And perhaps the one that stands out the most was the president saying he wanted to end endless wars in the Middle East. We even played that soundbite saying we don't need to have U.S. troops guarding the Turkey-Syria border for the next 50 years. But ironically, this administration announced on Friday that it was sending about 3,000 more troops to Saudi Arabia, along with fighter jets and missile defense weaponry in response to the attack on that country's oil fields. The U.S. continues to support Saudi Arabia in an endless war in neighboring Yemen, not to mention what is taking place in Libya and elsewhere. This is, it seems, an explanation that falls flat on its face when you look at the facts.
Well, this is, I think, a strategic disaster for the United States. The fact is that the Syrian democratic forces, the SDF, of which the Kurds dominate, they were the ones who were doing the heavy lifting in terms of fighting against the Islamic State Caliphate and securing the territory, pending some sort of political resolution. That may well have been far off, but what the president has really given up is all forms of leverage here. Whatever's going to happen, going forward in Syria, the United States has lost its ability to dictate any kind of resolution that is consistent with U.S. interests.
Another point, PJ, the president's attitude has been on this issue is let them fight it out. He constantly makes reference to these ongoing centuries-old battles in the Middle East, which is not accurate. But what is the risk in adopting the president's policy or approach, which is, let the Turks and the Kurds fight this out? How could that impact the region and spill over?
Well, sure, but we've created a vacuum, and who's likely to take full advantage of that vacuum? Russia, Iran, Syria, and potentially, as we were just talking about, the Islamic State. Last time I checked, anytime Russia, Iran, Syria, and the Islamic State are happy, that's not a situation that is consistent with the United States' interest.
Keir, PJ was talking about how Iran may be one of the countries filling in the vacuums. Talk to us a little bit about how the alliance of Syria, the Syrian government, I should say, Russia and Iran could in fact change the balance of what is happening inside Syria.
Well, that alliance, has already changed the balance inside Syria. And of course, this week we are seeing another profound shift. I think there are two things to say about it. Firstly, if there is a conflict between Turkey and the Syrian army run from Damascus, then that could suck in Iran, because Iran and Russia, of course, supports President Assad in Damascus. That's one thing. Another thing is that there are still US forces, special forces inside Syria, and they are in an area down towards the Israeli border and Jordan. Now, if the US got to a point where it felt it had to withdraw those troops, or indeed if the president just makes a gut instinct decision to withdraw all US troops from Syria, that would have Israel very, very worried indeed, because those troops are there, much like the US forces in the north of the country were there to support the Kurds. Those troops are there to hold back Iran and the Iranian forces that are in Syria, and to create a buffer, if you like, against more tension with Israel. So the Iranians cannot be forgotten in all of this. They are looming, and they can be sucked in more. And by the way, all of this could lead to a situation where America gets sucked back into the conflict. You just don't know how these events are going to play out.
Yeah, interesting point there by Keir. PJ, let me get your thoughts on the domestic politics of all this. Speaker Pelosi tweeting out just a short time ago that she and Lindsey Graham, in fact, discussed a joint resolution to overturn the president's dangerous decision in Syria immediately, and a, quote, stronger sanctions package than the White House is suggesting. First, let me get your thoughts. Can the decision to pull out of northern Syria be undone by domestic political pressure applied by Congress on the president? And second, would sanctions on Turkey, you think, from your understanding of Turkish politics and Turkish President Erdogan's mentality, work at this point?
Well, sanctions can be an effective tool, but they take time. By the time that sanctions would really take a bite out of the Turkish economy, chances are that President Erdogan, who has his own domestic, political considerations, will have accomplished what he wants to accomplish in Syria, which is to eliminate the prospect of a Kurdish autonomous region, like what we have in Iraq. So yes, over the long term, Syria sanctions can have an effect, but it's not likely to deter Erdogan in what he's trying to do in the short to midterm. I don't think it's a great idea, for Congress to become, a co-commander in chief. Congress has powers in terms of helping to shape foreign policy, but the president is commander in chief. And he has special responsibilities and powers with respect to to the military. But that said, he's done something which I think in some segment of American population will be popular,
right.
Removing troops from harm's way. But he's done it in the worst possible way. The image that we have right now in the Middle East is the United States has stepped to the side. Others are stepping forward. They are proving to be more reliable allies, Russia in particular, and that's going to have a long-term consequence in terms of perceptions of American leadership in an important part of the world.
Yeah, it's quite incredible when you think of the amount of pressure the president faced from his own administration, including the resignation of Jim Mattis and McGurk, that he still went ahead with this policy regardless. Keir Simmons, PJ Crowley, gentlemen, both, thank you very much.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.